Martin Luther King Jr. For years, Martin Luther King Jr. told his inner circle that the FBI was trying to destroy him. He believed his phones were tapped, his hotel rooms were bugged, and government agents were working to discredit his movement. His closest advisors worried he was becoming paranoid. The stress of leading the civil rights movement, they thought, was taking its toll. Even his wife Coretta sometimes wondered if the pressure was affecting his judgment. Then the files were released, and everything King suspected turned out to be true, and far worse than even he imagined. The FBI's campaign against King began in 1963 and was run directly by J. Edgar Hoover, who called King the most dangerous Negro in America. The operation wasn't just surveillance. It was a systematic effort to neutralize King through any means necessary. Declassified documents reveal an agency consumed with destroying one man, devoting more resources to this single target than to investigating organized crime families that were corrupting American cities. The FBI bugged King's hotel rooms across the country, recording his private conversations and intimate moments. They tapped his phones at home, at his office, and at the homes of his associates. They placed informants inside his organization, including some of his closest advisors who reported every strategic discussion directly to the Bureau. They tracked his movements, monitored his finances, and compiled dossiers on everyone in his life, from major donors to casual acquaintances. But surveillance was just the beginning. The FBI actively worked to sabotage King's reputation, his relationships, and his mental health. In one of the most disturbing operations ever conducted by a federal agency against an American citizen, the FBI compiled recordings of King's extramarital encounters and mailed them to his wife, Coretta. The package included an anonymous letter suggesting King should commit suicide before his sins were exposed to the world. The letter, declassified in 2014 after decades of legal battles, read in part, "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days. The implication was clear. Kill yourself, or we will destroy you publicly. This wasn't a rogue agent acting alone. The letter was drafted by FBI officials, approved through the chain of command, and sent as part of an official operation. FBI memos from this period reveal the calculated cruelty of the operation. Agents discussed timing the release of damaging information to coincide with King's Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, hoping to humiliate him on the world stage. They debated which journalists could be trusted to publish smears without revealing the FBI as the source. They strategized about how to replace King with a more acceptable black leader who would be easier to control and less threatening to the status quo. The campaign extended beyond King himself. The FBI worked to prevent King from meeting with world leaders, warning foreign governments that he was a communist agent and a threat to international stability. They attempted to block his funding sources by approaching donors with damaging allegations and threatening to expose their association with him. They tried to prevent him from receiving honorary degrees and awards, pressuring university administrators and award committees behind the scenes. When King was assassinated in Memphis on April 4, 1968, his family immediately suspected government involvement. For decades, this was dismissed as grief-fueled conspiracy thinking, the desperate need to find meaning in senseless tragedy. But in 1999, a civil jury in Memphis found that government agencies were indeed part of a conspiracy to kill King. The verdict, reached after weeks of testimony and evidence, received almost no mainstream media coverage. The story was buried, just as King's warnings had been buried during his lifetime. The FBI files on King weren't fully released until decades after his death, and some remain classified to this day. What has been released reveals an agency that devoted more resources to destroying one civil rights leader than it did to fighting organized crime, investigating domestic terrorism, or pursuing actual threats to national security. King was right. His own government was trying to destroy him. He just didn't know how far they were willing to go. Ernest Hemingway. In the final years of his life, Ernest Hemingway became convinced that the FBI was following him. He told friends that agents were tapping his phones, reading his mail, monitoring his bank accounts, and tracking his movements across the country. He believed his house in Idaho was bugged, and that even his doctors were reporting to the government. He saw surveillance everywhere, in cars that seemed to follow him, in strangers who appeared too frequently, in the clicking sounds on his telephone line. His friends and family were concerned. The greatest American writer of the 20th century seemed to be losing his mind. His wife, Mary, later wrote that his paranoia was one of the most painful aspects of watching him decline. She would find him checking the house for listening devices, peering out windows at parked cars, afraid to speak freely even in his own home. The man who had faced wars, bullfights, and African safaris was now terrified of shadows. His doctors at the Mayo Clinic treated him for depression and delusions. They diagnosed him with paranoid ideation, a clinical term for believing things that aren't true. He received electroshock therapy, which he blamed for destroying his memory and his ability to write. "They're destroying me," he told friends after the treatments. "They're taking away my livelihood." Doctors assured his family that the treatments were helping, that his paranoid delusions were symptoms of mental illness that required aggressive intervention. On July 16, 1961, Hemingway put a shotgun to his head and pulled the trigger. He was 61 years old. His death was attributed to mental illness, a tragic end for a literary giant whose mind had finally broken under the weight of imaginary persecutors. Then, nearly 30 years later, author A.E. Hotchner, one of Hemingway's closest friends who had personally witnessed his paranoid behavior, filed a Freedom of Information Act request for Hemingway's FBI file. He expected to find little, perhaps a few pages noting Hemingway's political statements or his time in Cuba. What he received was 127 pages documenting FBI surveillance of Hemingway spanning decades. The file confirmed that the FBI had indeed been monitoring Hemingway since the 1940s. Agents tracked his movements in Cuba, where he lived for many years. They monitored his correspondence with friends, family, and publishers. They kept records of his travels, his associates, and his political statements. They opened investigations based on his perceived leftist sympathies and his friendship with Cuban revolutionaries. The surveillance intensified in Hemingway's final years, exactly when he began telling people he was being watched. The FBI was monitoring his activities at the Mayo Clinic. They were tracking his finances and flagging unusual transactions. They were, as he claimed, reading his mail, intercepting letters before they reached him, and copying them for bureau files. Hemingway wasn't paranoid. He was perceptive. The FBI was doing exactly what he said they were doing, exactly when he said they were doing it. His delusions were accurate observations. A.E. Hotchner later wrote, "It's the saddest story I've ever heard. Here's a man who was so tormented that he couldn't write, couldn't function, and underwent electroshock therapy that destroyed his memory. And the whole time, he was right. The people he trusted to help him were treating him for a disease he didn't have. The man who told friends that the FBI was watching him was treated as mentally ill. He received treatment that damaged his brain because his delusions were considered symptoms of psychosis. He killed himself in despair, believing that his mind had betrayed him, and the files proved that every word he said was true." Hemingway's case raises a haunting question. How many other people have been institutionalized, medicated, or dismissed as mentally ill for accurately perceiving that they were under government surveillance? How many paranoid delusions were actually clear-eyed assessments of reality? Jean Seberg. Jean Seberg was an American actress who became an international star after appearing in Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless in 1960. She was beautiful, talented, and increasingly political, supporting civil rights causes and donating money to organizations like the Black Panther Party. For this, the FBI decided to destroy her. The declassified files revealed that Seberg became a target of COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program designed to disrupt and neutralize political organizations the Bureau deemed subversive. But Seberg wasn't a political leader or revolutionary. She wasn't organizing protests or advocating violence. She was an actress who wrote checks to causes she believed in. That was enough to make her an enemy of the state. In 1970, Seberg was pregnant with her second child. The FBI saw an opportunity to inflict maximum damage. Agents drafted a plan to plant a false story in Hollywood gossip columns, claiming that Seberg's baby was not fathered by her husband, French author Romain Gary, but by a prominent Black Panther leader. The goal, stated explicitly in FBI memos, was to cheapen her image with the general public and cause possible embarrassment to the Black Panthers. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally approved the operation. His handwritten notes on the memo survive in the declassified files. The planted story ran in Joyce Haber's column in the Los Angeles Times, without naming Seberg directly, but providing enough details that she was easily identifiable. Newsweek then ran a story naming her explicitly, spreading the false rumor to a national audience. The gossip spread through Hollywood and beyond, destroying her reputation and her marriage. Seberg, who was 7 months pregnant, was devastated by the false accusations. The stress was overwhelming. She couldn't escape the whispers, the looks, the questions. Days after the Newsweek article appeared, she went into premature labor. Her baby, a girl named Nina, died 2 days after birth. Seberg insisted the baby was her husband's, and indeed, photographs of the infant clearly show she was white. But the damage was done. The stress of the manufactured scandal had contributed to the premature birth. An innocent woman had lost her child because the FBI wanted to punish her for her political donations. Seberg never recovered. She held an open casket funeral for her baby, inviting journalists to see for themselves that the FBI's story had been a lie. But the retraction never matched the original accusation. The damage to her reputation was permanent. She attempted suicide on the anniversary of her baby's death for years afterward, a ritual of grief that her friends came to expect and dread. She became addicted to pills and alcohol. She told friends that the FBI was still watching her, still trying to destroy her. Again, she was dismissed as paranoid, a troubled actress losing her grip on reality, unable to move past her tragedy. She was found dead in her car in Paris on September 8, 1979, from an apparent overdose. She was 40 years old. A note found nearby suggested she had never recovered from her daughter's death, the death the FBI had caused. The FBI files on Seberg weren't fully declassified until after her death. When they were released, they confirmed everything she had claimed. The Bureau had deliberately planted false stories about her pregnancy. They had continued surveilling her for years after the operation. They had worked systematically to destroy her career, her marriage, and her mental health. The FBI's own documents described the operation against Seberg as a success. They had neutralized a target. That target was a woman whose only crime was supporting civil rights, and whose punishment was the death of her child, and ultimately herself. Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was 21 years old when the FBI decided he was too dangerous to live. As chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, Hampton had done something that terrified the Bureau. He was bringing people together. His Rainbow Coalition united Black Panthers with Puerto Rican activists and poor white communities, a multiracial alliance that threatened the existing power structure in ways that purely racial movements never could. Hampton was electric. He could walk into a room of hostile strangers and walk out with new recruits. He could speak to college students and gang members with equal effectiveness. He was organizing free breakfast programs for children, health clinics for the poor, and political education classes that were transforming consciousness across Chicago. He was 21 years old and building a movement that scared powerful people. Hampton knew he was being watched. He told his followers that the FBI had targeted him, that informants had infiltrated his organization, and that his life was in danger. He spoke openly about the possibility of his own death, telling crowds that he expected to be killed for his work. Some dismissed this as revolutionary rhetoric, the kind of dramatic statements young radicals made to inspire followers. They were wrong. The FBI files, declassified years later, revealed that Hampton was one of the most heavily surveilled individuals in America. The Bureau had assigned him a threat designation, normally reserved for foreign spies and terrorist leaders. They had placed an informant, William O'Neill, in his inner circle, so close that O'Neill became his bodyguard and head of security. The man protecting Hampton's life was reporting to the people planning his death. O'Neill provided the FBI with detailed floor plans of Hampton's apartment, marking the location of every room, every door, every window. He reported on Hampton's schedule, his habits, his sleeping patterns, and when he would be most vulnerable. He identified which bedroom Hampton used and where his bed was positioned. On the night of December 1st, 1969, O'Neill slipped a barbiturate into Hampton's drink. ensuring he would be heavily sedated and unable to respond to what came next. At 4:45 a.m. on December 4, 1969, a tactical unit of Chicago police officers, working in coordination with the FBI, raided Hampton's apartment. They didn't knock, they didn't announce themselves, they simply opened fire. They fired approximately 99 shots into the residence. The occupants fired once, possibly 0 times, as some evidence suggests even that single shot was discharged accidentally by a dying panther. This was not a shootout. This was an execution. Fred Hampton was killed in his bed, shot twice in the head at close range while unconscious from the drugs O'Neill had given him. He never woke up. He never had a chance to surrender or resist. He was 21 years old. His girlfriend, Deborah Johnson, who was 9 months pregnant with his child, was in bed beside him. She survived. Their son, Fred Hampton Jr., was born 25 days later. Initially, police claimed they had been met with heavy gunfire and responded in self-defense. They displayed weapons allegedly recovered from the apartment. They called it a justified raid on a dangerous criminal organization. The media largely accepted this narrative, but evidence quickly emerged that contradicted the official story. Crime scene analysis showed nearly all bullets traveled into the apartment, not out of it. The bullet holes police pointed to, as evidence of Panther gunfire, were actually nail heads. The FBI had provided the police with detailed intelligence, floor plans, and the knowledge that Hampton would be drugged and unable to resist. A subsequent investigation by a federal grand jury exposed the lies. Ballistics proved the shootout was actually an assault on sleeping people. The displayed weapons had been staged. The entire operation had been planned with the intent to kill Fred Hampton. Survivors received a $1.85 million settlement from the federal government, an implicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but no one was ever prosecuted for Hampton's murder. William O'Neill, the informant who provided the floor plans and drugged Hampton, was given a new identity by the FBI. He killed himself in 1990, on the anniversary of Hampton's assassination. The files confirmed what Hampton had told his followers. The FBI was trying to kill him. He was right, and he died anyway. John Lennon. John Lennon spent the last decade of his life believing he was under government surveillance. He told friends that his phones were tapped, that he was being followed by men in suits, and that the Nixon administration was trying to deport him, not because of visa issues, but because of his anti-war activism. He saw agents in crowds at his concerts. He noticed the same faces appearing in different cities. He heard clicks and static on his phone lines that suggested monitoring. His concerns were often dismissed as the paranoia of a famous rock star, unused to normal life. Of course, people followed him. He was a Beatle. Of course, his phone sounded strange. Fame attracts strange attention. His friends gently suggested he was being self-important, seeing conspiracies where there were only fans and coincidences. In 1981, historian John Wiener filed a Freedom of Information Act request for Lennon's FBI file. What he received, after years of legal battles that went all the way to the Supreme Court, was over 400 pages documenting extensive surveillance of the former Beatle. The files revealed that the FBI had monitored Lennon since at least 1971, when he moved to New York City, and became increasingly involved in anti-war activism. The Bureau tracked his movements across the country. They recorded his public statements and analyzed them for evidence of subversion. They monitored his associations with activists, musicians, and political figures. They compiled information on his plans for concerts, his funding sources, and his connections to the anti-war movement. But the surveillance was more than passive observation. The Nixon administration actively sought to deport Lennon, using a 1968 marijuana conviction in London as the legal pretext. Declassified documents show that this was not routine immigration enforcement. It was a coordinated effort between the FBI, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the White House to remove a political opponent from the country before the 1972 election. Internal memos show the Nixon administration feared that Lennon would use his celebrity to mobilize young voters against the president. They discussed strategies to neutralize his influence. They coordinated with Senate staffers who were sympathetic to their goals. They applied pressure on INS officials to expedite deportation proceedings and deny appeals. The campaign against Lennon was personally directed from the highest levels of government. Nixon aide John Dean mentioned Lenin in White House strategy sessions. Senate staffers provided intelligence to the FBI. The full machinery of the federal government was deployed against a musician because he opposed the war in Vietnam. Lenin fought the deportation for years and ultimately won his green card in 1976 after Nixon's resignation made the campaign against him politically untenable. But the files prove that his suspicions were accurate. The full weight of the federal government had been deployed against him because he used his fame to advocate for peace. Some of Lenin's FBI file remains classified to this day, more than 4 decades after his death. The Bureau has argued that releasing certain documents would compromise national security and reveal intelligence methods. What secrets about the surveillance of a rock musician could possibly threaten national security? The government won't say. The classification continues. Lenin was murdered by a deranged fan in December 1980, an act apparently unconnected to government surveillance. But the files prove that when he told people the government was watching him, he was telling the truth. His paranoia was perception. Frank Wilkinson. Frank Wilkinson spent 27 years trying to obtain his FBI file. When he finally received it in 2010, at age 95, shortly before his death, it contained 132,000 pages. It was one of the largest files the FBI had ever compiled on an American citizen. Stacked, the pages would stand taller than a person. Wilkinson's crime? He was a housing activist in Los Angeles who advocated for public housing and opposed segregation in the 1950s. He believed that poor people deserved decent places to live and that race shouldn't determine where someone could make a home. For this, the FBI designated him a threat to national security and surveilled him for over 50 years. The files reveal an operation of staggering scope. The FBI tracked Wilkinson's movements across the country, noting every city he visited, every hotel where he stayed, every meeting he attended. They tapped his phones at home and at work. They read his mail, opening and copying letters before sending them on. They placed informants in organizations he belonged to and cultivated sources among his colleagues and neighbors. They compiled detailed reports on his family members, his friends, and anyone who associated with him. When Wilkinson was subpoenaed to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1958, he refused to answer questions about his political beliefs or associations. Unlike those who invoked the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination, Wilkinson invoked the First Amendment, arguing that the government had no right to investigate his thoughts or associations. For this principled stand, he was sentenced to 1 year in federal prison. The FBI files show that the Bureau worked behind the scenes to ensure his prosecution and imprisonment. They provided information to the committee, suggesting lines of questioning and identifying areas of vulnerability. They coordinated with prosecutors on strategy. They monitored the trial and reported on its progress. They continued surveilling him even while he was in prison, tracking his communications and monitoring visitors. After his release, Wilkinson founded the National Committee Against Repressive Legislation, dedicated to abolishing HUAC and protecting civil liberties. The FBI responded by intensifying their surveillance. They tracked the organization's activities, monitored its members, and worked to undermine its effectiveness through infiltration and disinformation. For decades, Wilkinson told anyone who would listen that the FBI was watching him, that the government was persecuting him for his beliefs, that America was not living up to its constitutional promises of freedom of speech and association. He was largely dismissed as a bitter radical with a persecution complex, a man who saw conspiracies because he couldn't accept that his political views had simply become unpopular. Then the files were released, and 132,000 pages proved him right. Wilkinson's file documented surveillance spanning from 1942 to 1993. Over 50 years, covering his entire adult life. The FBI had devoted more resources to monitoring one housing activist than most field offices spent on violent crime. They had tracked him from young idealist to elderly advocate, never losing interest, never concluding he wasn't a threat. Wilkinson died in 2006 at age 91, having spent his final years reviewing the documentation of his own persecution. In interviews, he expressed a mixture of vindication and horror. Vindicated that his claims were proven true, horrified at the scope of what had been done to him. "I knew they were watching," he said. "I just didn't know how much. I couldn't have imagined how much." Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez founded the United Farm Workers Union and led the fight for dignity and fair wages for agricultural laborers, some of the poorest and most exploited workers in America. For this, the FBI considered him a threat to national security. Chavez suspected FBI surveillance throughout his career. He told union members that their phones were tapped, their meetings were monitored, and informants had infiltrated their organization. Some believed him, others thought he was being dramatic. The struggle for farm worker rights was hard enough without adding government conspiracies to the mix. The declassified files prove Chavez was right about everything. The FBI opened a file on Chavez in the 1960s and maintained surveillance for decades. They tracked his movements across California and beyond. They monitored his public speeches and private conversations. They compiled reports on union activities, strategy sessions, and organizational meetings. They placed informants inside the UFW, who reported directly to FBI handlers. But the Bureau went beyond mere surveillance. Declassified documents show the FBI worked actively to undermine Chavez and the farm worker movement. They shared intelligence with growers who opposed the union. They coordinated with local police departments to harass UFW members. They fed negative information to journalists in hopes of damaging Chavez's public image. The files reveal that the FBI categorized Chavez alongside violent revolutionaries and foreign agents, despite his unwavering commitment to nonviolent resistance. His tactics of boycotts, marches, and fasting, explicitly modeled on Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., were treated as threats to national security. The Bureau seemed unable to distinguish between a labor organizer seeking fair wages and an enemy of the state. One of the most disturbing revelations involves the Bureau's monitoring of Chavez's health. When Chavez undertook extended fasts as a form of protest, including a 36-day fast in 1988 that severely damaged his health, FBI agents tracked his condition and reported on his medical status. They were watching to see if their target would die. Chavez died in 1993, and the FBI file was eventually released through FOIA requests. It confirmed decades of surveillance and interference in the farm worker movement. Every paranoid warning Chavez had given his union members was validated by the government's own documents. Today, Cesar Chavez is honored with a federal holiday. The man the FBI once classified as a national security threat is celebrated as an American hero. But during his lifetime, he was watched, monitored, and undermined by his own government for the crime of organizing poor workers. Viola Liuzzo. Viola Liuzzo was a 39-year-old mother of 5 from Detroit who traveled to Alabama in 1965 to participate in the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. On March 25, 1965, while driving marchers back to Selma, she was shot and killed by Ku Klux Klan members who had pulled alongside her car. What happened next would remain hidden for decades. One of the 4 Klansmen in the car that night was Gary Thomas Rowe, Jr., an FBI informant who had been embedded in the Klan for years. Rowe was in the car during the murder. Some evidence suggests he may have fired one of the shots that killed Liuzzo. When Liuzzo's family demanded answers, the FBI responded not with transparency, but with a smear campaign. Within hours of her death, Bureau agents began spreading rumors that Liuzzo had been having an affair with a black man, that she had abandoned her children, that she had been a drug user. They leaked this misinformation to journalists, to local police, and to anyone who might help damage her reputation. The FBI file on Liuzzo, released years later, reveals the extent of the cover-up. The Bureau knew within hours that their informant had been present at the murder. They knew the identities of all 4 killers. Instead of immediately providing this information to prosecutors, they focused on protecting their informant and discrediting the victim. The smear campaign was devastatingly effective. Stories about Liuzzo's alleged immorality spread through the media. Her grieving family was forced to defend her honor while simultaneously mourning her death. The focus shifted from the Klan's violence to the victim's character, exactly as the FBI intended. 3 of the 4 Klansmen were eventually prosecuted, though none served more than 10 years. Rowe, the FBI informant, was never charged. The Bureau protected him, relocated him, and gave him a new identity. For decades, the Liuzzo family fought to learn the truth about Viola's death and the FBI's role in covering it up. They filed lawsuits and FOIA requests, they testified before Congress, they refused to let the smears stand. The files eventually released confirmed their worst suspicions. The FBI had an informant in the murder car. They had destroyed evidence. They had actively worked to discredit a murdered civil rights worker to protect their own operations. Viola Liuzzo died fighting for voting rights. The FBI file proves that her government responded by trying to destroy her memory. Black Panther Party leadership. By 1969, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had declared the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. Not organized crime, not foreign espionage, not domestic terrorism. The greatest threat, in Hoover's assessment, was a group of young black activists running breakfast programs for children. The Panthers knew they were being watched. They told anyone who would listen that the FBI had infiltrated their organization, that police were coordinating with federal agents to destroy them, that they were being set up for assassination. Most of America dismissed these claims as the paranoid ravings of dangerous radicals. Then the files were released, and they confirmed a systematic campaign of surveillance, infiltration, sabotage, and murder that exceeded even the Panthers' most alarming warnings. The declassified COINTELPRO documents revealed that the FBI placed informants in virtually every Black Panther chapter in the country. These informants weren't just gathering intelligence, they were actively working to destroy the organization from within. They spread false rumors to create internal conflicts. They provided floor plans to police planning raids. They identified leaders for neutralization. The FBI deliberately fomented violence between the Panthers and other black organizations. Bureau agents sent forged letters, made anonymous phone calls, and spread disinformation designed to provoke shootings between groups. Declassified memos show agents celebrating when their provocations resulted in violence. The scope of the operation was staggering. The FBI maintained files on tens of thousands of individuals associated with the Panthers. They monitored bank accounts, tracked movements, and intercepted mail. They coordinated with local police departments across the country to conduct raids, make arrests, and harass members. The results were devastating. By 1970, the FBI's own documents boasted that the party had been largely neutralized. Leaders were dead, imprisoned, or driven into exile. Chapters had collapsed or been torn apart by internal conflicts the FBI had engineered. The breakfast programs and community services that had made the Panthers popular were dismantled. The Panthers had been right about everything. The FBI was infiltrating their organization. Police raids were coordinated with federal intelligence. Leaders were being targeted for assassination. The most paranoid predictions of government persecution turned out to be understatements. Today, FBI officials acknowledge that COINTELPRO represented a serious abuse of power. The programs have been officially discontinued, but the files remain a testament to what the government was willing to do to Americans who challenged the status quo, and a reminder that those who warned about it were dismissed as paranoid until the proof emerged. Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg was a military analyst with top-secret clearance who became convinced that the American government was lying to the public about the Vietnam War. He had seen the classified documents. He knew the truth. And he believed the American people had a right to know what their government was really doing. In 1971, Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, a classified study revealing that the government had systematically lied about the war for decades. The leak was one of the most significant acts of whistleblowing in American history. The Nixon administration responded by trying to destroy him. Ellsberg claimed that the government was conducting illegal surveillance against him, that agents were breaking into offices connected to him, and that a secret operation existed to discredit and neutralize him. These claims were dismissed by many as the defensive posturing of a man facing serious criminal charges. Then the truth emerged, not through declassification, but through the Watergate investigation. Investigators discovered that Nixon had created a secret unit called the Plumbers, whose first assignment was to destroy Daniel Ellsberg. The Plumbers broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, looking for information that could be used to discredit him. They planned to assault him physically at a public rally. They discussed killing him. The FBI, meanwhile, conducted extensive surveillance of Ellsberg, his family, and his associates. They tapped phones, followed his movements, and compiled massive files on everyone connected to him. They coordinated with the Nixon White House on strategies to destroy his credibility and ensure his conviction. The criminal case against Ellsberg collapsed when the extent of government misconduct became clear: the break-in at his psychiatrist's office, the illegal wiretaps, the coordination between the FBI and the White House. A federal judge dismissed all charges, citing government misconduct so severe that a fair trial was impossible. Ellsberg had been right about everything, not just about the lies that led America into Vietnam, but about the illegal campaign to destroy him for exposing those lies. The government that he had served with top-secret clearance had turned its full power against him for telling the truth. Ellsberg spent the rest of his life as an advocate for whistleblowers and government transparency. He died in 2023 at age 92, having lived long enough to see many of his warnings about government secrecy and abuse of power proven correct by subsequent revelations. The man who leaked the Pentagon Papers was initially portrayed as a traitor. History remembers him as a hero. The FBI files confirm that his claims of government persecution were not paranoid delusions. They were accurate descriptions of what his own government was doing to him. These 10 cases share a common thread: individuals who claimed they were being targeted by their own government, who were dismissed as paranoid or delusional, and who were ultimately proven right by the government's own documents. Martin Luther King Jr. was right. The FBI was trying to destroy him, up to and including encouraging his suicide. Ernest Hemingway was right. He was being surveilled so extensively that it contributed to his mental breakdown and death. Jean Seberg was right. The FBI planted false stories that led to the death of her baby. Fred Hampton was right. The FBI was planning to kill him, and they did. John Lennon was right about Nixon's deportation campaign. Frank Wilkinson was right about decades of surveillance. Cesar Chavez was right about infiltrators in his union. Viola Luzzo's family was right about the FBI's involvement in covering up her murder. The Black Panthers were right about systematic government persecution. Daniel Ellsberg was right about illegal operations against him. The pattern is undeniable. American citizens who challenged power were monitored, harassed, discredited, and in some cases killed by agencies sworn to protect them. When these targets tried to warn others about what was happening, they were dismissed. Only decades later, when the files were finally released, did the truth emerge. This raises disturbing questions that extend beyond these specific cases. How many other people were right about government surveillance but never lived to see their vindication? How many were institutionalized for paranoid delusions that turned out to be accurate perceptions? How many died believing they had lost their minds, when in fact their minds were working perfectly well? The FBI officially ended COINTELPRO in 1971, following public exposure of its abuses. Officials have expressed regret for the excesses of the past, but surveillance capabilities have expanded dramatically since then. Programs revealed by Edward Snowden showed that the government now monitors communications on a scale that J. Edgar Hoover could never have imagined. When people today claim they are being watched, how should we respond? The historical record suggests that dismissing such claims as paranoid is itself a form of complicity. The targets profiled in this video were right. They were telling the truth, and almost no one believed them until the proof emerged. The files exist. They document what was done to American citizens by their own government. They prove that the conspiracy theories weren't theories at all. They were accurate descriptions of reality. And they remind us that the most important question isn't whether someone sounds paranoid, but whether they're correct. 10 targets, 10 files, 10 vindications that came too late. The next time someone claims the government is watching them, perhaps we should consider the possibility that they're telling the truth. History suggests they might be right.